Our opening reading today is an excerpt from Don't Label Me by Irshad Manji. Lily, an older dog that I adopted, had one huffy mama. I grumbled to her that the home of the brave was anything but. What bravery did it take to let us and them coagulate into us against them? Even people who called themselves progressives acted as if progress only meant accosting the other side. Good luck changing the world that way. To achieve justice, devotees of justice must change ourselves, I sighed to Lily, and I suggested how that could happen at a time when almost everybody feels besieged. While I poured out my thoughts, Lily would tilt her head again and again, and as if she wondered, "What are you smoking, Mama?" Or, "Can you clarify?" Or, "Have you considered an opposing opinion?" Over time, Lil's questions sent me in search of alternate perspectives, Eastern and Western, scientific and philosophical, radical, liberal, conservative, and populist. Each of these a label, and each a reminder that nobody owns the entire truth. More often than not, labels eclipse truth. This I learned about Lily's labels. She was old and she was blind, but to love her rather than love my specious assumptions about her, I had to suspend what I knew about Lil merely by how she looked. I had to defang the force of ego, the most pervasive and pernicious power there is. Until I tempered my need to be right all the time, I'd never understand her. I'd continue relying on these categories. I'd settle for fake facts that labels hand to us, not only about Lily, but about everybody. Labels keep us all in our assigned place. At root, that's why we are divided. So as we light this chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, let us reflect on the words of the proposed new interdependence value from Article 2. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. We covenant to cherish the earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the greater web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships. So our story today for the time of For All Ages is The Sour Grape. The Sour Grape by Jory John and Peter Oswald. I am a grape. A sour grape. Brr. If somebody upsets me, I'll remember it. If somebody wrongs me, I won't forget it. If somebody insults me, I'll ignore it. Nope. See that banana over there? That banana slipped and bumped into me, so I'm holding a grudge. See that orange? That orange didn't call me back for a week. Grudge. See that lime? That lime borrowed my scarf and never returned it. Grudge. I suppose I've got pretty thin skin for a grape. Nobody steps on this grape. Granted, I wasn't always this way. I grew up in a close-knit bunch. There were about 3,000 of us in our little community, and we were sweet to each other. We all lived on a vine. Sure, it was a bit claustrophobic, especially when we were trying to get ready in the morning. But my family was ripe with humor, goodwill, and warmth. We did our best with what we had. My grandparents visited on the weekends, and we'd stroll in the sun, and they'd teach us what they knew. They said that it takes a bunch to raise a seed. They said that good grapes roll their own way in life. And they told us to be kind, forgiving, considerate, and grateful. Or grateful, my grandpa used to say with a wink. And above all, no matter what life throws at you, there will be a lot. Try to stay sweet, my grandma said. Indeed, we said in response. And for a while, I was the sweetest of the sweet. I said, please. I said, thank you. I brushed aside life's little annoyances, and I knew how good I had it. But then one day, something changed in me. It was my birthday. I had rigorously and vigorously planned a party for weeks. I'd sent out invitations with the date prominently displayed. Get this, I had a Ferris wheel and a magician and hay rides. I had snacks upon snacks upon snacks. But the highlight of the party, though, was going to be the fireworks display, which would happen at sundown. So I stood out front and I waited for folks to arrive. I had a gigantic smile on my face, and I waited. Everybody was a little late, it seemed. No big deal, no big whoop. So I waited, and a tumbleweed rolled by. A coyote howled in the distance, and the sun sank behind the hills, and I waited. Nobody showed up, and I mean nobody. By the time the fireworks show started, with me as the sole spectator, I was scowling. I considered everybody I had invited, and only one thought came to mind. Grudge, grudge, grudge. After that, my personality became something else entirely. I went from a sweet grape to a bitter grape to a snappy grape, and finally I became a sour grape. Urgh. I started holding minor grudges that eventually became major grudges. I scowled so much that my face got all squishy. I took my grumpiness out on others. And that's just how it's been, day after day, week after week, month after month, grudge after grudge. But something happened recently that changed my thinking. I was getting ready to go meet up with my friend Lenny, the only fellow I knew who was as sour as I was. Lenny and I usually go to the park where we sit on a bench and we rant about stuff. But just as I was heading out the door, I bumped my knee. Ouch! And after I bandaged myself up, I discovered I had a flat tire. Then I missed the bus, and the next bus was late. And finally, I got off on the wrong stop. So by the time I arrived at the park, it was getting dark, and Lenny was fuming and furious. And with a frown and a furrowed forehead, he looked all squishy. I tried to explain why I was so tardy, but Lenny wouldn't listen. He had already made up his mind. He had formed a huge grudge, and he wouldn't budge. I couldn't believe it. How unfair, I thought. How ridiculous, I thought. How similar I would have reacted. Well, Lenny was pretty worked up. He was pacing back and forth and emitting occasional grumbles. His tone was tart. So I gave him a little space. Besides, it was nice out. I noticed the sky changing colors, the melodic chirping of the birds, the evening breeze, the buzz of the park's insects coming alive at night. And I suddenly felt grateful and peaceful and calm. Had I been missing all this simple beauty because I was too busy complaining? Meanwhile, as Lenny stormed off, muttering something about disrespect and lack of consideration, I'm pretty sure I heard him say, "Grr," too. I walked home and I pulled a dusty box out from under the bed. There were old family photos inside. and I spotted myself in one of the pictures. I was so sweet. I knew that little grape from the photo was still a big part of me, deep down. It would just take some work to get it back there again. And at that exact moment, I found the invitation I had sent out for my infamous birthday party, the one where nobody showed up. It said May 31st. Wait a minute. My birthday was on May 21st. Alas, I told everyone to come on the wrong day. It was all my fault. I realized nobody's perfect, not even me. And after that day, I started noticing other things too, like how remaining sour all the time is so draining. I've wasted so much energy holding grudges when I could easily have cleared the air if I felt hurt. And yes, I still get upset from time to time, but that's okay, because now I talk and I listen and I work things out instead of just walking away. My sourness is fading. I'm letting go of all my grudges. And hey, it's working. Sure, sometimes I still let out a little when I'm frustrated, like this. But then I move on. My face is less squishy too. Oh, and don't worry, things are okay with Lenny again. Do you know what? If you look at things in the right sort of way, and if you remember to be kind and considerate, forgiving and grateful, life really can be pretty sweet. Yes, indeed. Now for our interlude. Our centering words are an excerpt from the Messages from the Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss. Anger is a defense of the ego, defense against fear, fear of being humiliated or embarrassed, fear of being minimized or being mocked, fear of loss, of losing face, and indeed fear of losing, fear of not getting your way. We think anger protects us against the others who would do those things to us, who likewise are angry at us. Anger is a pernicious and useless emotion. It is dissolved by understanding and by love. When a negative emotion is understood, when its roots are eliminated, the energy behind the emotion diminishes and even disappears. When you feel angry, the healthy response is to learn what caused the anger, to rectify the situation if that is possible, and then to let go of the anger. We are all connected. We are all the same. We are all rowing the same boat. So let's take a moment of silence to reflect on these words. Years ago, I read the book, Don't Label Me by Irshad Manji. And then I did a sermon on what that book inspired in me. I started that sermon with a very painful confession of how I was emotional and upset the night Donald Trump won the election, and how I had uncharacteristically drove around my neighborhood in the wee hours of the morning, destroying Trump signs and collecting others for a sacrificial burning. I was a sour grape, enraged by the shattered expectations of my fellow American neighbors. Now, some people took my confession as a political rant and they stopped listening. They missed the entire point of my sermon, which is that we as human beings are subject to human conditions. These conditions include that we label and categorize things and people around us. It is natural. It is our way of understanding what is harmful for us and what is not. What do we need to fight and what do we need to flee from? As social creatures, we also like to share information. Who doesn't like to do that? It's a validation for us. And we often allow others to influence that and how we define our labels that we use and what they mean. The socialization starts with our parents, but then expands to teachers and ministers and leaders and media personalities and media outlets and others that we trust. Then, everyone likes to feel powerful. Who here does not like to feel powerful? Just what I thought. So, but to retain power, so many of us feel that to be powerful, somebody else must be powerless. They shame those who do not look like them, or think like them, or act like them. There are the others who we are to be blamed for our woes, and those seeking power, whether it's wealth or influence, game all of us by playing on our emotions to get the collective we to go along with their agenda, whether they believe in their own propaganda or not. So our news sources today are full of examples, day in and day out, of this trifecta of shame, blame, and game. And it is a social human pattern that infiltrates all of our interpersonal relationships. Whether we're conscious about it or not, it is there, deeply ingrained. That all of us, including myself, as a reasonable, open-minded, even-tempered person, falls into these traps and sometimes snaps. So a few days after my uncharacteristic response to the election of Donald Trump, I recognized that I had been gamed, and in doing so had stopped listening to a diversity of viewpoints. I had treated those who supported Mr. Trump's election as my enemy, and maybe a few other labels, and not as my neighbor. In the 4 years since that sermon, I have diligently tried to avoid the trap of shaming, blaming, and gaming. I have tried to step back and look at issues as people, not labels. People, my neighbors, each with their own story and their own needs, trying to resolve a conflict. But to be honest, it has been hard. Hard because the polarization of our country has widened further, making it difficult to reach my neighbor. So, what is behind this polarization? Well, I have a few theories, but first let's consider some elements that influence, I think, this polarization. The first one is confirmation bias. So, confirmation bias is a psychological term for the human tendency to seek out information that supports one position or our position or ideas. This causes us to have a bias towards the original position, because if you only seek out information that supports one idea, you will only find information that supports that idea. Confirmation bias is our tendency to cherry pick information that confirms our existing beliefs or ideas. Confirmation bias explains why two people with opposing views on a topic can see the same evidence and come away feeling validated by it. And where do we get our bias? Well, remember, we get a lot of that through our socialization. We let others dictate or influence the biases and beliefs that we have through labels and what those labels mean. Of course, our socialization starts at home and rarely changes, sometimes with experience, but rarely changes. But certainly for the last 100 years, mass media has been a heavy influencer, and now social media affects all of us. So, with the elimination of the fairness doctrine during Reagan's administration, broadcast media outlets no longer needed to devote time to contrasting views on issues of public importance. The advent of the 24-hour news cycle pushed media to be more sensationalized in order to keep viewers and therefore their revenues higher. And of course, the explosion of social media in the past 20 years has created a platform for people to share on an unchecked means of myths and disinformation that is spread as more Americans get their news online. Many Americans are now in self-selected information silos where they trust the news that they receive as a confirmation of their beliefs, because all other news is fake, where contrasting views on issues of public importance are never heard, and opinion pieces soon resonate as facts. So, why are we polarized? Well, for me, it's as simple as the divide and conquer tactic. This is a strategy used by the powerful to keep the masses fighting amongst themselves so that they do not band together to join against the powerful, which is typically a small group. And despite what many of you are thinking, that tactic is not used solely by one political party. It's used by individuals, by businesses, by governments, by institutions, by employers, to keep the status quo or to gain power so that they create their own status. This tactic is exploitation of people's emotions and not necessarily based on facts. We have seen it in the culture war attacks on women's rights, non-white histories, LGBTQ+ and trans individuals, diversity, equity, and inclusion measures, immigrants, and freedom of speech in our educational institutions and on our streets as we protest, all in the name, of course, of security, parental rights, and preventing politicization of our educational system and indoctrination into an ideology. So, I think the question is, who or what benefits from our current polarization? Can our society withstand this level of polarization where neighbors look at each other as enemies? Can our country? So I recently came across a quote that really summed up for me our current situation in the United States, and it goes, "This country has become, frankly, a warfare state built on affluence, a power structure in which the interest of big business, the obsessions of the military, and the phobias of political extremists both dominate and dictate our national policy. It also seems that people of the country are, by and large, reduced to passivity, confusion, resentment, frustration, thoughtlessness, and ignorance, so that they blindly follow any line that is unraveled for them by the mass media." This quote is from Thomas Merton in his 1963 book, The Cold War Letters. So now while you're thinking about that, I'd like to take a station break and take your offering. Please be as generous as you can. Your gifts are what help us to keep the lights on, the buildings intact, the staff to keep things running smoothly, and programming to challenge you and bring you comfort. For those of you online, or those here on your cell phone, there's a link to donate in the description on the YouTube video or on our website right under the description of today's service, or use this handy QR code that's on the screen or on the back of your order of service. Let this sacred time begin. So, back to our questions. Some people say that our current state of polarization is a result of the election of our first black president. And while I agree that it seems to have fueled the heightened political rhetoric, the demonization of those who don't think or act or look like us, the diminishment of trust in our credentialed experts and our institutions, and the attack on our democratic norms, I want to go back to Mr. Merton's quote which seems to be just as relevant today. It was written at a time of polarization as well. Could today's polarization be a long-standing backlash against the civil rights movement, where people of color, Latinos, women, and finally LGBTQ individuals gained some forward momentum, where the white majority's world was upended? In today's polarization created by powerful people in the background trying to return us to a fascist democracy. Yes, I said fascist democracy. The U.S. has a long history of articulating a liberal democracy, while Black, Indigenous, and communities of color within the U.S. have often lived under a fascist state. So how many of you here think you know the definition of fascism? A few. The author, Shane Burley, defines fascism as a set of political practices fundamentally based on upholding rigid and identity-based hierarchies. These hierarchies manifest as forms of supremacy depending on the country and the cultural context. We know that the German Nazis looked to the Jim Crow laws in the United States as a model on how to oppress minority groups. So many of us know about the rise of Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy that came not as a revolution by force, but by playing as a revolution from the inside, by playing on the emotions of the majority, using the media of the day to divide and conquer to gain power. They used fear and anger in their propaganda to make the majority of the citizens see themselves as a victimized community whose woes could be placed at the feet of the minority groups and whose government had abandoned them by not listening to their woes and taking action. The Nazis and fascists integrated themselves in the schools, the law enforcement, and into the government itself. They slowly created policies to oppress and eventually kill those who disagreed with the Nazi fascist regime. But even more concerning was that they were successful in getting long-standing neighbors to look at each other as enemies. So, are we there yet? Do we know who is creating and funding all the draconian laws that are so eerily similar to each other that are being passed not only in our state, but all around the country? Is there any way to find out? And if so, if it was publicized in the mass media, would we accept that we are being gamed by powerful people who are both liberal, conservative, and somewhere in between? Or will the cries of fake news and fraud and witch hunt keep us happy in our confirmation bias? So I want to read now another quote from a poster that I recently purchased at our General Assembly. This poster is by the artist Ricardo Levin Morales, and it's called The Price of Silence. First, they came for the immigrants, and I did not speak up because I was not an immigrant. Then they came for the teenage mothers, and I did not speak up because I was not one of them. Then they came for the gays and lesbians, and I did not speak up because I was not lesbian or gay. And then they came for the people of color, but as they left me alone, I did not speak up. Then they came for the Jews, the elderly, the radicals, the farmers, the disabled, the trade unionist, the poor, the artist. But I believed they were doing it for me, and I did not speak up. Then they came for me, and by then, there was no one left to speak up. I wonder if the Germans and the Italians felt that way at the end of the war. So, for our democracy and our society to continue, it is imperative that we speak up and make sure that our Constitution and especially our First Amendment rights are not trampled. And not just for ourselves, but for our neighbors, those who we do not agree with, and with those neighbors with whom we disagree. Because if we don't, one of us may be the next target. Wow, that is some pretty heavy stuff. So what can we do? Everyone just seems so angry and unwilling to be neighborly. How can we bridge this divide? So Dr. Weiss wrote, anger is a defense of the ego, a defense against fear. Anger is dissolved by understanding and love. When a negative emotion is understood, when its roots are illuminated, the energy behind the emotion diminishes and even disappears. So, as a young person, I thought that, I could change my spouse or person I was partnering with. How many of you ever done that? Yeah, I'm seeing a few nods. Okay. So, let's perhaps figure out, who can we change? Can we change other people? No. We can only influence other people. Who can we change? That's right, just ourselves. So let's start with ourselves and reflect on our own emotions. Like the sour grape, are you holding on to a past grievance? Are you a sour grape? Do you know a sour grape? Have you ever been a sour grape? Raise your hand. Yeah, I'm seeing quite a few. Thank you. Can you admit that you and everyone around you is imperfect and should be shown some grace? Can you ask questions of others in a humble and safe manner, with curiosity instead of judgment, where you just listen? Can you not be defensive if you hear something you find offensive? One of the things that I learned at GA that I really liked was that we need to create messy spaces. And what do they mean by that? Messy spaces? That means that it's okay to mess up. That this is a safe place to mess up so that we can learn together. Can you remember that disagreement on its own does not equal hate? And are you willing to build trust with your neighbor by being authentic and therefore vulnerable to others' judgments? Can you be aware of your position of privilege when speaking with others? Can you show care and compassion to your enemies? So it won't be easy, and it takes courage, but it can also bridge divides. I'd like to share a few personal examples. So one of our parents shared with me a story that I'm going to paraphrase, and hopefully I'm getting it pretty close. And the story goes, one of the neighbor boys who held a lot of influence in their small community paid another boy to beat up her son. Well, fortunately, the boy who was supposed to do the beating confessed before any harm was done. So full of righteous distress, the mom walked to the neighbor's home to confront this behavior. Now, the neighboring family clearly did not hold the same political viewpoints as our parent. And on the day that she went to their home, there was a party in progress. So the father was called to the door and immediately was in a defensive mode, ready to fight whatever was going to be the accusation. But instead of berating the son and the defensive father, she instead started the conversation by saying she loved his son, that his son was a great kid, and that he was a leader in the neighborhood. Well, the father's defenses dropped a little bit. And she continued, as a leader, his son needed to understand the responsibility of being a leader, and that the behavior of paying a child to harm another was not acceptable. That his peers looked up to him to show them how to be good people. Well, by that time, the father was agreeing with her and immediately talked to the son about what was said. Both neighbors walked away happy with the results. Lead with love and care, not defensiveness. So the second example happened a few months ago. While enjoying a breakfast at my local diner, I entered into a conversation with an older woman who was vocally espousing the typical conservative talking points. So with curiosity and without judgment, I asked her why she felt the way she did, and I listened. And even though I did not agree with her on most things, she did say something that got me thinking. We were talking about being woke and all that gay stuff. And she finally looked at me and said, I really don't care who you love. That's your business. I just don't want it to be shoved down my throat. Well, of course, my first reaction was to think to myself, come on, get over it. But isn't that what white supremacists say to those who are marginalized? Was I as tone deaf as they are? Are we shoving it down those who have just now started accepting things that their whole lives have been taboo? Are we liberals and progressives placing the thoughts and feelings of those who we are allied with above others and ignoring the thoughts and feelings of those that we don't agree with? Are we the pot calling the kettle black? Aren't we all striving for the same thing? Aren't we striving for security, a comfortable life, and justice? Is there a place to find common ground where everyone feels heard and respected? Can we really accept diversity, including the diversity of viewpoints? Lots of questions, a little direction, but you have to go figure it out. Welcome to Unitarian Universalism. So, call me an optimist, but I think there is. I think that we can intentionally listen to different information silos, that we can reach out to friends who we have written off because of their views, and to talk with strangers that you don't know. But we have to start, and we have to listen, because we are all connected. We are all the same. We are all rowing the same boat. We are neighbors, not enemies. And so now we'll go to our closing words, titled Outwitted by Edwin Markham. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. So let us extinguish our chalice, as we say, our chalice lighting words. Extinguish words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our heart until we are together again. May it always be so. Thank you.